he was the son of a billionaire, living in a mansion filled with every luxury money could buy. But despite all the toys, the clothes, and the endless riches, there was one strange detail that no one could ignore. This little boy never slept with the lights off. Night after night, every lamp in his enormous bedroom had to stay glowing because the moment darkness came, he would scream, cry, and refuse to close his eyes. For years, his mother and the staff thought it was just a spoiled habit, an odd behavior of a child who had grown too used to getting everything he wanted. But everything changed the day a new butler entered his life. Unlike the others, he was patient, kind, and curious enough to ask why. And what he discovered behind Alex's fear was a shocking truth that no amount of money could ever hide. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We'd love to know that Alex was born into a very rich family, but his life began with something very sad. His father, Gregory, died while giving birth to him. Alex never had the chance to know him or hear his voice. His mother, Rebecca, was a billionaire who had everything money could buy. But when her husband died, something changed in her. She didn't know how to deal with the pain, so she worked all the time to keep herself distracted. She didn't spend much time at home. When she did, she barely looked at Alex. People outside their home thought he had a perfect life with a big house, expensive things, and a famous last name. But inside, he was just a little boy growing up, without his dad and without his mom's love. Even though he was always surrounded by things, he was very lonely. His life looked beautiful from the outside, but inside it felt empty from the very beginning. As Alex started to grow, his world was filled with beautiful toys, colorful clothes, and fancy furniture. His bedroom was huge, filled with stuffed animals, action figures, books, and decorations that looked like they belonged in a castle. But no matter how many things he had, something important was missing. Someone to hold him when he cried. Someone to sing to him before bed. The house had many rooms, but they felt cold and quiet. There were always servants around, nannies, cooks, cleaners, but they changed all the time. Alex could never get close to them. Just when he started trusting one, they would be gone and someone new would take their place. His mother thought she was giving him everything he needed, but she didn't understand that love and time were more important than money. He often sat alone in his big room, wondering what his father had been like, and wishing he could see him, even just once. Alex became used to the silence of the house, but it never felt right. The only voices he heard were those of people hired to take care of him, but they didn't really know him. They followed orders and made sure he was clean, fed, and dressed, but they didn't sit down to talk to him or play with him for very long. The few times his mother was home, she would ask if he was doing okay, but she seemed far away, as if her mind was still thinking about work. He always nodded yes, even if he didn't mean it, because he knew she didn't really want to hear more. Alex learned to keep his feelings inside. Sometimes he would look at his reflection in the mirror and try to imagine his father standing behind him, brushing his hair. He tried to make up stories about his father's smile and laugh. It was the only way he could feel close to someone he had never met. Nights were the hardest for Alex. When the sun went down and the house grew dark and quiet, he felt the weight of being alone. He couldn't fall asleep unless all the lights were on. It wasn't just a fear of the dark, it was a fear of the emptiness, the silence and the shadows that reminded him of everything he didn't have. Every night he asked the staff to leave the lamps on. Some questioned it at first, but he insisted, and after a while, they stopped asking. With the lights on, he could imagine someone was there, maybe his father watching over him. But even then, his sleep was never peaceful. He often woke up in the middle of the night, sweating, his heart beating fast, unsure of what had scared him. He would sit up and look around the room, trying to remind himself that he was safe. But the feeling of safety never really came. As Alex got older, he didn't grow out of his need for the lights. Other kids his age might have been going to sleepovers, playing outside, or laughing with their parents. Alex stayed home in his large but empty world. At school, he didn't talk much. Some of his classmates were curious about him because they knew his mother was rich, but Alex didn't let anyone get too close. He felt like no one could understand what his life was like. How could he explain that he had everything, but still felt like he had nothing? He started writing in notebooks, short stories, imaginary adventures, and drawings. In these stories, he gave himself a different life. one where his father was alive and his mother smiled. It was his way of escaping for a little while. Still, no matter how much he wrote, the real world never changed. His house remained quiet. His mother remained distant, and his heart remained heavy. Throughout those early years, Alex began to realize that money could never fix what was broken. He had been given a life of luxury, but it came without the love that most children need. The truth was, he would have traded all the toys, clothes, and gifts for one real hug from his father, or one honest conversation with his mother. He had learned to smile when needed, to answer politely when spoken to, and to hide his sadness deep inside. No one around him noticed that he was hurting, and maybe they didn't want to notice. They thought that since he had everything, he must be fine. But Alex knew the truth. He was just a boy who had been left with too many things and not enough love. And each night, as the lights stayed on and he lay awake in his big bed, he waited for a peace that never came, falling asleep only when his body gave up from the weight of another day alone. By the time Alex turned 7, his fear of darkness was no longer seen as something small or childish. It had become a fixed rule in his life, something that could not be ignored or easily changed. Every night before bedtime, he would demand that all the lights in his room stay on. If anyone dared to switch them off, he would scream and cry until his voice cracked. Sometimes he would run to the corner of the room, covering his head with his arms. Other times, he would sit on his bed with his knees pulled up, refusing to sleep until the light returned. At first, Rebecca thought it was a normal phase, something all children went through, and she believed it would stop eventually, but it didn't. It grew stronger. The staff began whispering about it in hallways, rolling their eyes or shaking their heads, calling it an addiction to light, or saying he was spoiled beyond reason. This routine continued every single night. Alex's demands became predictable, but also exhausting for the people around him. Some butlers tried to negotiate, telling him they would leave just a small lamp on, but he always refused. A single lamp was not enough. He needed every corner of the room bright. His fear was not just about the dark itself. It was about the feeling that something terrible was waiting for him when the shadows came. No one saw this because no one asked. Instead, they sighed loudly or scolded him, telling him to grow up. Rebecca grew frustrated too. She spent most of her time at work, but when she was home, she would snap at him, saying he was making a scene for no reason. Alex never argued back. He would just sit there crying quietly, hugging his knees to his chest as if holding himself together. To everyone else, he was just being difficult, but inside he felt trapped. The whispers among the staff became crueler over time. Some said he was just spoiled because he had no father to teach him discipline. Others laughed, calling him the little prince who can't stand the dark. Alex overheard some of these comments when he passed by hallways or when he sat behind doors. Each word cut him deeply, but he never responded. He didn't know how to explain what he felt. He didn't have the words to tell anyone why the darkness terrified him so much. He only knew that when the lights went out, his body would freeze. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, only cry silently. His heart would pound and he would feel like he couldn't breathe. It wasn't a game. It wasn't about getting his way. It was real fear, a kind he couldn't control. But no one saw that. They only saw a boy who demanded lights as if it were a luxury, not a desperate need. Some nights were worse than others. Sometimes a butler would forget to leave a lamp on or would turn the lights off by mistake, thinking Alex had fallen asleep. The moment the room went dark, Alex would wake up screaming. His voice would echo through the halls, and he would shake violently until someone came running to turn the lights back on. After these episodes, he would sit up for hours, too scared to close his eyes again. The next morning, he would be tired and pale, but no one comforted him. The butlers looked at him with annoyance, and his mother's face grew colder. She started sending him to bed with warnings instead of kisses or kind words. "If you don't stop this nonsense, Alex, I won't tolerate it," she would say before walking out. He would nod, but as soon as she left, his eyes filled with tears because he knew he couldn't stop, no matter how much he wanted to. Alex's fear shaped his daily life too. At school, he was quieter than other children. He didn't talk about his nights, but he was always tired. His teachers thought he stayed up late playing with toys or watching television, but that wasn't the truth. He stayed up late because he couldn't sleep in peace, always watching the corners of his room, even with the lights on. When his classmates invited him to sleepovers, he refused, making up excuses. He didn't want anyone to see how afraid he was. He also didn't want to risk being in a dark room somewhere else. This secret made him feel even lonelier. He wanted to tell someone, but he didn't trust anyone enough. Even the notebooks he wrote in didn't hold the full truth. In his drawings, he would sketch big, dark shapes around a small figure of a boy. It was his way of showing his fear without words, but nobody noticed what the pictures meant. Yet inside Alex, the real reason for his fear remained. It was not about spoiled behavior, not about wanting attention, and not about being stubborn. It was about the emptiness he had felt since the day he was born. Without a father, without a mother's warmth, the dark felt like a living thing to him, a place where all his sadness stayed hidden and waited to swallow him. He had a wound inside his heart that no one could see, a wound that felt bigger whenever the lights went out. But because no one asked, no one knew, he looked like a stubborn little boy to everyone on the outside. But in reality, he was still carrying a secret pain he couldn't name. Each night, as the room stayed bright and he hugged his knees tightly, tears rolled down his face. Alex felt the same heavy fear again and again, a secret wound still bleeding, unseen by anyone around him. One spring morning, Rebecca decided to hire a new butler. The old one had quit without notice, saying the job was too much. He wasn't the first to leave like that. Over the years, many butlers had come and gone. Some lasted weeks, others only days. They all seemed kind at first, but soon lost their patience with Alex's habits, especially his fear of the dark. This time, the new butler's name was Albert. He arrived early, wearing a simple uniform and holding a small suitcase. His eyes were calm, and his smile seemed real, not forced. He didn't seem nervous like most new butlers did. When he met Rebecca, he greeted her politely, and she gave him the usual instructions. Basic cleaning, meal help, and looking after Alex. She didn't mention the fear of darkness, as if she had grown tired of repeating it. Albert nodded and got to work right away. He walked through the house, learning his duties, but also quietly observing everything around him. Alex noticed Albert on the first day. He watched him from behind doors, corners, and stair railings. After so many staff changes, Alex had stopped trying to make connections. People always left. They either grew angry with him or just got bored and moved on. So when Albert arrived, Alex didn't say much. He simply stared, trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Albert, on the other hand, didn't force conversation. He cleaned gently, spoke softly to the cooks and other workers, and smiled at Alex whenever their eyes met. He didn't talk about his rich mother, or comment on how big the house was, or ask why Alex looked so serious all the time. He just treated him like any other child. It was strange for Alex. It didn't feel fake. When Albert passed him in the hallway and said, "Good morning, Alex," it wasn't in a cold or tired voice. It was kind, and it felt honest. Later that afternoon, Albert brought Alex a snack without being asked. It was a simple sandwich and some fruit, not fancy desserts or anything expensive. He placed it gently on the table and said, "You don't have to eat it now, just if you're hungry." Then he walked away, not waiting for praise or thanks. Alex looked at the plate and then looked at Albert, who was now dusting the shelves across the room. There was something different about him. He wasn't trying too hard, and he wasn't avoiding him either. He didn't seem scared of Alex's silence or his habits. Alex didn't touch the food right away, but later, he ate it. And when Albert came back and saw the empty plate, he just smiled and gave a small nod. That moment stayed in Alex's mind. It was small, but it mattered. Albert wasn't like the others. He didn't push. He didn't ignore. He stayed present in a quiet, calm way. That night, Rebecca told Albert to handle Alex's bedtime. She said it quickly, not looking up from her tablet. "He's a handful. Just make sure he's in bed and try to turn the lights off. If he screams, leave them on." Albert didn't ask questions, just nodded and walked upstairs. Alex was already in bed, sitting under the covers with his arms around his legs. He looked at Albert as he entered the room, unsure of what to expect. Albert smiled and walked over slowly, didn't speak loudly or move too fast. Placed the blanket gently around Alex's feet and said, "Are you comfortable?" Alex nodded once. Then Albert reached toward the light switch. The moment his hand moved, Alex's eyes widened. A second later, he screamed. It wasn't a small scream. It was loud, sharp, and filled with panic. Albert froze in place, didn't keep going. He didn't roll his eyes, turned back toward Alex and stepped away from the switch. Alex was shaking. breath was uneven, and tears were already falling from his eyes. He had screamed louder than he had in months. Usually, after such a moment, the butlers would sigh loudly, leave the room, or mumble something about him being spoiled. But Albert didn't do any of that. He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at Alex, not with judgment, but with concern. "I'm not going to turn it off," he said quietly. "I'm here. You're safe." He didn't try to touch him or ask him to explain. He just sat there waiting. Slowly, Alex's crying slowed down. His breathing started to return to normal. He looked at Albert, still afraid but confused too. No one had ever reacted like that. No one had ever paused. Albert didn't act like someone annoyed or scared. He looked like someone who truly wanted to understand. Alex didn't say anything, but he didn't pull away either. Albert stayed by Alex's side until he was fully calm. Didn't rush, didn't leave the room quickly, and didn't act like it was just a job to finish. Sat quietly, not talking unless Alex looked at him. When he did speak, his voice was always low and steady. "I'll stay here for a little while, okay?" he said. Lex nodded slowly, still curled under his blanket. Albert didn't ask about the lights again. He didn't try to fix the fear or tell Alex it was silly. He just accepted it, and that made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, Alex didn't feel ashamed. He didn't feel like a problem to be solved. He felt noticed, not for his last name, not for his fear, but for being a person. As the minutes passed, Alex's eyes grew heavy. He finally fell asleep with all the lights on. But this time, he wasn't scared. Albert was there, and that changed everything. For the first time, Alex felt like someone wasn't annoyed by his fear, but curious to understand it. That small difference meant everything. Albert hadn't said much, but his actions showed more care than anyone else had in years. He didn't treat Alex like the billionaire's son or a spoiled boy with a strange habit. He treated him like a scared child who needed someone to listen. That night marked a quiet but important change. Alex didn't know what would happen the next day, or if Albert would stay for long, but something inside him felt a little different. He didn't feel alone in his fear anymore. Someone had seen it and stayed beside him. As Albert sat quietly in the chair beside the bed, watching over him without making him feel watched, Alex slept a little easier. The room was still bright, but it didn't feel so cold. And for once, his fear didn't feel like a burden someone wanted to get rid of. Over the following days, Albert became Alex's favorite person in the entire mansion. From the very first morning after the bedtime incident, Alex felt safer when Albert was nearby. He watched him carefully at first, still unsure if he would turn out like all the others. But Albert's behavior never changed. He stayed patient, calm, and kind. He invited Alex to sit with him at breakfast, asked what he liked to eat, and even encouraged him to talk about his toys. No one had ever really asked Alex those things before. When Albert had time between his chores, he played small games with Alex, simple ones that made him laugh. Sometimes they read books together with Albert using funny voices to bring the characters alive. Alex's laughter echoed in the halls. Something rare in the house. The other servants noticed the difference, but kept their distance. To Alex, Albert didn't feel like staff. He felt like someone who truly cared. As the days passed, Alex started looking forward to Albert's presence. He would peek around corners, waiting for him to arrive with a smile. At mealtimes, he would eat more when Albert sat nearby, because it made him feel comfortable. Albert also told him simple stories from his own life. Nothing exaggerated, just small events about when he was a child or about his younger brother. Alex listened carefully, fascinated by the way Albert described things in such a natural way. It made him realize that not everyone grew up in giant houses with butlers and drivers. He began to ask questions, something he rarely did with anyone else. Albert never made him feel silly for asking. Instead, he explained patiently, always using words Alex could understand. Bit by bit, Alex felt something inside him opening, like a door he had locked for a long time. He didn't notice it himself, but he was beginning to trust again. It wasn't easy for Alex to share his thoughts, but Albert gave him the space he needed. He never forced him to talk. Instead, he created moments where Alex could speak freely if he wanted. One afternoon, they were sitting by the window looking outside at the garden. Alex quietly said, "I don't like when people leave." Albert turned to him, listening closely, but didn't push for more. He just said, "I understand. It hurts when that happens." That simple response made Alex feel less alone. He had never heard an adult answer like that before. Most people ignored his words or brushed them aside. Encouraged by Albert's reaction, Alex began to share more. Little by little, he spoke about his toys, his favorite colors, his dreams at night, and even his fears. These words had been kept inside for years, but now they were coming out piece by piece. Albert treated every word with respect, as if they truly mattered. Nighttime remained the hardest part of Alex's days. The fear of darkness never left him, but with Albert nearby, it felt a little less overwhelming. One evening, after a long day, Albert went upstairs to help Alex prepare for bed. Alex didn't resist this time, brushed his teeth, changed into his nightclothes, and climbed under the blanket without complaints. But when Albert reached to leave, Alex quickly grabbed his hand. His grip was tight, almost desperate. "Don't go," Alex whispered. "Don't turn it off." His voice trembled with fear, but also with hope that Albert would understand. Albert didn't hesitate. I nodded softly and sat back down in the chair by the bed. He didn't move his hand away. Alex kept holding on, small fingers wrapped tightly around Albert's. The light stayed on. The room remained bright. And for once, Alex didn't feel like he was fighting his fear alone. Someone was there with him. Albert stayed by Alex's side until his eyes grew heavy. He hummed softly, not a song with words, but a simple tune, steady and calm. Alex found comfort in the sound. He stared at the light on the ceiling for a while, but then turned his gaze to Albert, who smiled at him warmly. "You're safe," Albert said. "I'll be here." Alex nodded and closed his eyes for the first time that night. It didn't take long for sleep to come, though his grip on Albert's hand didn't loosen until his body finally relaxed. Albert didn't leave immediately. He stayed a little longer, watching over him. This was something none of the other butlers had ever done. They had always rushed to finish the task and leave. But Albert was different. He didn't see Alex's fear as a problem, saw it as a wound that needed care, and he was willing to stay with him through it. Unlike the other butlers, Albert didn't see Alex's condition as misbehavior. He didn't see it as stubbornness, nor did he believe the whispers that Alex was spoiled. He saw the fear for what it was, something real and heavy that Alex couldn't fight alone. Each night, he stayed with him. Each time he listened without judgment, the bond between them grew stronger. Alex didn't understand it fully yet, but he could feel something changing in his heart. The loneliness he had carried for so long wasn't as sharp when Albert was near. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. Albert's patience, his gentle words, and his willingness to stay made all the difference. A fragile but powerful bond was forming between them, one that Alex had never experienced with anyone before. Without realizing it, Alex was beginning to trust again. And in doing so, he started to fill his heart with something he thought he had lost forever. One evening, Albert sat with Alex on the floor of his large bedroom, helping him organize the many toys scattered everywhere. There were action figures, stuffed animals, puzzles, and blocks, enough to cover half the carpet. Most of them had been given as gifts over the years, but Alex rarely touched them. Tonight, though, he seemed more comfortable with Albert there, and for once, he picked up the action figures and arranged them carefully in a row. Albert encouraged him by asking gentle questions like which ones were his favorite and what names he had chosen for them. Alex answered quietly, but with more honesty than usual. As he reached for another action figure, he looked at Albert and softly said, "Grandpa, can you hand me that one?" The word came out naturally, without hesitation. Albert froze where he was sitting, startled by the sound of it. Alex, however, kept speaking, as if nothing unusual had happened, his small hands busy with the toys. Albert's heart skipped, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. The word "grandpa" hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He looked at Alex, who continued to play, completely unaware of what he had said. It didn't sound forced or deliberate. It was like a slip, a piece of something buried inside Alex that had come out without thought. Albert realized that Alex hadn't noticed at all, that he had spoken the word as though it naturally belonged. Albert thought about correcting him, about gently saying his real name, but something stopped him. He understood what this moment meant. Alex had never known a father's embrace, never had someone who stayed by his side at night or gave him the comfort he craved. Without realizing it, Alex was finding that in him. Albert's chest tightened. He wasn't Alex's grandfather, and he never could be. But right now, he mattered to the boy in a way no one else did. The evening continued quietly, but Albert couldn't shake the feeling of what had just happened. He watched Alex closely, seeing how natural the slip had been. Alex asked him to sit beside him while he played with the action figures, and Albert did, though his mind was still on the word. Alex laughed softly when arranging the toys, a sound Albert had only begun to hear in recent days. Albert stayed calm, responding to his questions. But inside, his emotions swirled. He knew that Alex was not confused. He wasn't mistaking him for Gregory. He was simply giving a name to the feeling he had inside. The comfort of being cared for, the warmth he had longed for all his life. Albert thought about how lonely the child must have been, and how strong that emptiness had grown over the years. By calling him Grandpa, Alex wasn't asking for perfection. He was asking for something simple, someone who made him feel loved and safe. That night, when bedtime came, the usual routine began again. Alex climbed into his large bed, clinging to the blanket nervously, his eyes already darting to the corners of the room. The lamps stayed on, and Albert was there as always, but this time felt different. Alex didn't just demand that the lights remain. He also reached out his hand for Albert to hold. "Don't go," he whispered, his eyes pleading. Albert sat down on the edge of the bed, holding his small hand firmly. He remembered the word from earlier, the slip that revealed so much. Albert's heart ached in that moment. He couldn't give Alex his father back. He couldn't replace what had been taken from him at birth, but he could be here now as someone steady and real. He stayed by his side, not moving, letting Alex drift into sleep slowly, his breathing growing calmer, with Albert's hand still wrapped around his. Albert didn't leave after Alex's eyes closed. He stayed in the room, watching him sleep under the glow of the lamps. For the first time, Alex seemed to fall asleep more peacefully, without the sudden jerks of fear that usually shook him awake. His face looked softer, calmer, almost free. Albert felt a deep sadness, but also a sense of responsibility. He knew he was not meant to stay forever. Servants always came and went, and he might not be different in that sense. But the way Alex looked at him, the way he had spoken that word, showed that something important was happening. Albert realized Alex wasn't asking him to replace Gregory. The child wasn't asking for a perfect grandfather, just for someone who cared enough to stay. Albert whispered softly, even though Alex couldn't hear him, "You're safe, little one. I'll stay tonight." And he kept his promise, staying until the house was silent and steady. Albert's heart ached because he understood the truth. He could never replace Gregory, the man Alex had never known but had lost before he even had the chance to love him. Still, Albert saw clearly what Alex was really searching for. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't someone flawless or untouchable. Alex was searching for something far simpler, love. He needed someone who would not leave, someone who would not laugh at his fears, someone who would not turn away when he asked for comfort. Albert felt the weight of it, but he also accepted it from that night forward. He promised himself that as long as he was here, he would give Alex what he could. He would not turn off the light. He would not walk away when Alex asked him to stay. He would give him love, even in small ways. And in that moment, Alex unknowingly found a piece of what had always been missing from his nights. Rebecca began noticing changes in her son. For years, Alex had been quiet, distant, and afraid. But now, there was something different in him. He smiled more often, and sometimes she even heard him laugh when she walked past his room. At meals, he ate with less hesitation, and when he walked through the halls, there was a lighter step to his movements. At first, she was pleased, thinking maybe he was finally growing out of his strange habits. But soon something else caught her attention. One afternoon, as she walked by Alex's bedroom door, she heard his voice clearly. He was calling Albert not by his name, but by another word. "Grandpa," he said softly, with the same tone a child would use for their grandfather. Rebecca froze in place, her chest tightening. The sound struck her in a way she couldn't describe. Gregory had been gone since the moment Alex was born, and now that word felt like both a gift and a wound. At first, Rebecca felt angry. The word belonged to Gregory, the man she had loved deeply and lost far too soon. To hear Alex giving that title to someone else made her feel as though Gregory's memory was being replaced. It seemed wrong, even disloyal, that her son could call another man by the name reserved for his father. The thought grew inside her until she could no longer ignore it. That evening when Alex had gone to bed, she asked Albert to meet her in her office. Her tone was sharp, and her expression carried the weight of her frustration. When Albert entered, he stood quietly, waiting for her to speak. Rebecca didn't waste time. She demanded to know why Alex had started calling him Grandpa, her voice firm and full of accusation. To her, it seemed like Albert had encouraged it, that he had stepped into a role he had no right to claim. Albert listened carefully, his eyes steady. He didn't flinch at her anger or try to defend himself with excuses. Instead, he spoke gently, his voice calm but firm. He explained that he had never once asked Alex to call him that, nor had he hinted at such a thing. The word had simply slipped out of Alex's mouth one day, naturally, without thought. Albert told her he understood the weight of the name and respected the memory of Gregory. He wasn't trying to take his place, but he also reminded Rebecca of something important. Alex had never known what it felt like to be held by a father, never felt safe enough to rest his fears in someone's arms. That longing had lived inside him all his life. When he called Albert Grandpa, it wasn't because he wanted to replace Gregory. It was because he was finally finding comfort. Albert's words were steady, filled with both compassion and truth. Rebecca sat back in her chair, silent. Her explanation pierced through her anger, leaving behind something harder to face: sorrow. She thought about all the years she had buried herself in work, convincing herself that success and money would be enough to protect Alex. She had filled the house with toys, clothes, and stuff, but none of it had given him what he needed. The truth was in front of her now. Alex hadn't been searching for wealth. He'd been searching for love. The realization made her chest heavy. She thought of the times she had rushed through their short conversations, barely looking at him before leaving for work. She thought of his birthdays where expensive gifts replaced her presence. And now here was Albert, someone who had simply stayed, listened, and cared. That was all Alex had wanted. Someone to hold his hand when he was afraid. Someone to sit with him in the silence of night. Her first instinct was still to feel jealous, as if Albert had taken something that should belong only to her and Gregory. But as she thought longer, she realized it wasn't about being replaced. Gregory would always be Alex's father, even if he had never been there. Albert hadn't stolen that place. It filled a space Rebecca herself had left empty. She struggled with the truth, torn between pride and regret. She had always believed her way of protecting Alex was the right one, building walls of wealth and security. Yet, she was now seeing that her son had grown up in a house full of light, but also full of loneliness. Albert had stepped into that gap, not as Gregory's replacement, but as a presence Alex could trust. Rebecca saw it clearly for the first time. Her son needed more than material comfort. He needed real closeness, something she hadn't given him in years. Rebecca listened to Albert's words, torn between anger and sorrow, but unable to deny the truth. For years, she had hidden from her pain, convincing herself that working harder was the only way to move forward. But in doing so, she had left Alex to face his fears alone. The sight of him smiling again, the sound of his laughter, and even the word Grandpa were proof that he was healing in a way money could never provide. Rebecca's heart ached with guilt, but also with a strange sense of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to learn from this, to step back into her son's life with more than just wealth. As she sat there, Albert's calm explanation lingering in her mind, she realized what Alex truly wanted. He didn't want riches. He didn't want gifts. He wanted presence. He wanted someone to hold his hand in the silence of night. And that was something she could no longer ignore. Albert, determined to understand Alex's fear, began asking tender questions. He didn't rush or demand answers. Instead, he created moments when Alex could feel safe enough to share what he carried inside. During bedtime, when Alex was calmer and holding his hand, Albert would gently ask, "What makes the dark so hard for you? Or has something ever happened that made you afraid?" Alex didn't answer right away. He often stayed silent, turning his face toward the blanket, but Albert didn't push. He stayed beside him, showing through patience that he was ready to listen whenever Alex was ready to speak. Night after night, Albert repeated his quiet reassurance, reminding Alex that he didn't have to be afraid with him there. Slowly, the walls Alex had built began to weaken. His eyes held hesitation, but also a longing to finally tell someone. Then one quiet night, when the lights glowed softly in the room, Alex whispered words he had never spoken before. He confessed that years ago something had happened while his mother was away on one of her long trips. Rebecca had hired another caretaker to look after him, one of the many people who came and went through the mansion. But this one was different. He was strict, cold, and impatient with Alex's fear of the dark. That night, Alex had begged for the lights to stay on, but the caretaker grew frustrated. He told him to stop being spoiled, turned off the switch, and shut the door tightly. Alex remembered his small hands pounding against the wood, his voice screaming until it hurt, but no one came. The man ignored him completely, letting his cries echo into the silence. Hours passed in unbearable fear. The room seemed endless, every shadow turning into a threat. Alex felt forgotten. He felt invisible. Most of all, he felt sure that nobody would ever come back for him again. As he told the story, Alex's body trembled. He described the sound of his own crying, how his voice grew weaker as time stretched on. He said he thought maybe he had disappeared, that maybe the world had moved on without him. His small, frightened words carried years of silence. For Alex, that night had carved something deep inside him, a wound that never healed. He explained how from that moment forward, he couldn't stand the dark. It wasn't just darkness anymore. It had become the same as being abandoned, as being unloved, as being left behind forever. Albert held his hand tightly as he spoke, his chest heavy with emotion. He realized how much Alex had been carrying alone all these years. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't spoiled behavior. It was trauma. A memory so powerful that it shaped every night of Alex's life since. Tears welled in Albert's eyes as he listened, his heart breaking with every detail. Albert finally understood that Alex's fear was not about the absence of light, but about the absence of love. The night of abandonment had changed everything for him, bedding terror in his young mind, which was already sensitive to sudden changes and overwhelming fear. For Alex, darkness wasn't just shadows. It was proof that he didn't matter, that people could leave and never return. Albert felt anger rise toward the man who had ignored Alex's desperate cries. How could someone be so cruel to a child already struggling with loss and loneliness? But alongside the anger was sorrow. Albert wished he could erase that night from Alex's memory, wished he could go back in time and sit by his side so he would never feel that level of fear. He brushed Alex's hair softly and whispered, "I believe you. It wasn't your fault." Those words brought a tiny relief to Alex, who had waited years to hear them. For Alex, sharing the truth was both painful and relieving. He had hidden it for so long, believing no one would listen or care. Now, sitting with Albert, he felt a sense of release. The tears came freely, but they didn't feel as heavy as before. Albert stayed with him the entire time, never letting go of his hand, never turning his face away. For the first time, Alex didn't feel judged. He didn't feel like a problem to be solved. He felt seen. Albert assured him that his fear made sense, that anyone would be afraid if they were left alone like that. Alex's shoulders loosened, as if a weight had lifted just by being understood. The room was still bright, but something inside Alex felt lighter too. Speaking the truth didn't erase the memory, but it helped him see that he wasn't crazy for feeling the way he did, simply a child who had been hurt. Albert's heart broke at the story, but he also felt clarity. Everything made sense now. Alex wasn't afraid of the dark itself. He was afraid of being abandoned, of being erased from someone's memory. Just like the father he never met, and the caretaker who had shut the door that night. The truth explained every scream, every sleepless night, every desperate demand to keep the lights on. Albert hugged him gently, letting Alex rest against him. He did on promise that the fear would disappear overnight because he knew trauma didn't vanish so easily. But he promised that he would stay, that Alex would never have to face the dark alone again. Albert whispered, "You are not forgotten. You never will be." Alex closed his eyes, holding on to those words as if they were a shield. For the first time in years, he felt hope. Because at last someone understood the hidden scar that had ruled his life. When Albert shared Alex's secret with Rebecca, her face turned pale. She had expected some explanation for Alex's strange habit, but she never imagined it would be something so cruel. Albert told her gently, choosing his words carefully, but every detail pierced her like a blade. The story of how a caretaker had locked Alex in the dark, ignoring his cries, painted a picture she could not bear to see. Rebecca sat in silence, her hands pressed against her face as though trying to hide from the truth. She thought of all the years she had dismissed Alex's fear, as spoiled behavior and shame burned inside her. She realized now that she hadn't just misunderstood him, she had failed him. Her absence, her endless focus on business, had left him unprotected. She could not deny it anymore. The wealth she thought would shield him from pain had instead left him vulnerable to the cruelty and neglect of others. The crushing weight of guilt sank into Rebecca's chest. She had always believed she was doing the best she could by working hard and providing everything money could buy. But as Albert's words echoed in her mind, she saw how wrong she had been. Toys, clothes, and servants could never replace love. She had been physically alive in Alex's life, but emotionally absent. In her grief for Gregory, she had buried herself in business deals, trips, and meetings, leaving her son behind. And in those empty spaces, Alex's wounds had grown deeper. She remembered the times when he cried at night, and she told the staff to handle it. She remembered his birthdays where expensive gifts replaced time spent together. Now she understood that every missed moment, every absence had taught Alex one thing, that he was alone. Her fortune felt worthless compared to the pain in her son's eyes. For the first time, Rebecca felt truly powerless. That night, Rebecca couldn't rest. She walked through the halls of the mansion, replaying Albert's words in her mind. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, and for once, she noticed how cold and empty the house truly felt. Every corner reminded her of the distance between her and her son. She stopped outside Alex's door, her hand hovering over the handle. Weeks had passed since she last entered his room. Usually she avoided it, leaving the task to the staff, telling herself she was too busy. But tonight felt different. She knew she couldn't hide anymore. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the lamps glowed warmly, casting light across the room. Alex lay in bed, clutching his blanket, his eyes wide open, even though it was late. When he saw her step inside, his face showed confusion. Rebecca walked closer, her heart heavy but determined. For the first time in weeks, she was choosing to be present. Rebecca sat by his bed, the mattress dipping under her weight. Her hands trembled as she rested them on her knees, unsure of what to say. Alex stared at her as if trying to decide if she was real or just another fleeting moment. "I'm here," Rebecca whispered, her voice unsteady. The words felt simple, but to her they carried everything she hadn't said for years. She had never told him she was sorry. She had never told him he wasn't alone. But tonight, in those two words, she was trying to say it all. Alex blinked, his small face filled with hesitation. Slowly, he leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against her. Rebecca froze, afraid to move and break the fragile connection. Then, as if testing if it was safe, Alex rested his head against her arm. The gesture was small, but it struck her harder than any business victory ever could. Alex's body was tense at first, as though he wasn't sure if she would stay. Rebecca stayed still, letting him lean on her without pulling away. She could feel his tiny breaths against her sleeve, each one reminding her of how long he had been without this closeness. She thought of Gregory, the husband she had lost, and how he would have wanted her to be better for their child. Tears filled her eyes, but she held them back, not wanting to scare Alex. For years, she had been afraid of facing his pain because it reminded her of her own. But now, sitting here with him, leaning against her, she realized avoiding it had only made it worse. Alex didn't push her away. He didn't cry, simply stayed there, his head resting on her as if he was giving her one last chance to prove she wouldn't leave again. Rebecca's chest tightened, but she stayed. Rebecca, that moment was both painful and healing. Painful because she realized just how much time had already been lost. Years she could never get back. Healing because Alex, despite everything, was still willing to let her in. His trust was fragile, but it wasn't gone. Rebecca sat with him until his eyelids grew heavy, the light still glowing across the room. When his breathing slowed and his small hand brushed against her sleeve, she whispered again, "I'm here." This time, she didn't say it to convince herself. It was a promise. For the first time in a long time, she felt like a mother, not a provider, not a businesswoman, but a mother. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could fight to change the future. And in that quiet night, with Alex leaning against her, Rebecca believed that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over and finally give him what he needed. From then on, Rebecca tried to be present. It wasn't easy for her. Her entire life had been built around power, meetings, contracts, and endless hours at the office. Habits like that don't disappear in a day. Sometimes she still found herself reaching for her phone while sitting beside Alex, tempted to check emails or answer calls. But each time she remembered his face the night he leaned against her, and she put the phone down. Every evening, no matter how late she came home, she forced herself to step into his room. Alex looked at her with cautious eyes at first, expecting her to disappear again, but she stayed. She sat in the chair or on the edge of his bed, awkward at times but determined. She didn't always know what to say, and sometimes silence filled the space. Yet the difference was clear. She was there. And for Alex, that simple presence mattered more than anything. Albert noticed the effort Rebecca was making. He could see she was uncomfortable at times, unsure how to connect with her own son, but she was trying, and that was new. Together, they created small rituals that gave Alex a sense of safety. Sometimes Rebecca would read to him, her voice unsteady at first, but improving with practice. Alex would listen quietly, occasionally correcting her when she misread a word. Other nights, Albert told short stories while Rebecca held Alex's hand, letting him feel the comfort of two people staying by his side. The consistency became powerful. Alex began to expect these moments, looking forward to bedtime instead of fearing it. For Albert, it was rewarding to see mother and son growing closer. For Rebecca, it was uncomfortable, but also deeply meaningful. She was beginning to understand something that had been missing in her life all along. Her son didn't need a perfect mother. He needed one who stayed. Slowly, small changes appeared in Alex's behavior. The child who once demanded every light in the room remain on began to accept less. At first, he allowed only one lamp to stay bright while the others were dimmed. It still took time, but each step forward was a victory. One night, he whispered that a gentle lamp by his bed was enough. Albert squeezed his hand, proud of his courage. Rebecca nearly cried at the sight, realizing how much trust it took for him to accept even a little darkness. These changes weren't forced. They came naturally because Alex felt safe. He no longer believed that darkness meant abandonment. Now he understood that even if the shadows filled the room, someone would be sitting beside him when he opened his eyes. The lights no longer had to fight his fears alone. He had his mother and Albert, and that made the difference he had been waiting for. His entire life, the bond between them grew stronger with each passing night. Rebecca began to understand her son's little habits, the way he tapped his fingers when nervous, how he hugged his stuffed rabbit when he needed comfort, or how he relaxed when Albert hummed softly. She paid attention in ways she had never done before. Alex, in turn, started to open up to her. He asked her questions about her day, about his father, and about the world outside the mansion. Rebecca didn't always know how to answer, but she did her best. For the first time, their conversations weren't forced. We're building trust, one small word at a time. Albert often sat quietly watching them, his heart full. He had seen Alex broken by loneliness, and now he was seeing him rebuild piece by piece. The house no longer felt like a cold place filled with silence. It was beginning to sound and feel like a home for Albert. Watching the change was more rewarding than anything he had experienced in his years of work. He had entered this mansion as just another butler, unsure how long he would stay. But now he realized he had become part of something bigger. Alex trusted him, leaned on him, and loved him in a way he hadn't expected. And Rebecca, once cold and distant, was learning too. Albert saw her walls slowly crumble as she allowed herself to feel guilt, love, and responsibility all at once. He didn't see himself as Gregory's replacement, nor did he want to. Instead, he felt proud to stand beside mother and son as they rebuilt what had been broken. Every night, he watched Alex smile. Every night he saw him fall asleep with less fear. Albert felt that his presence had meaning. He had helped turn pain into healing, and he knew this bond was something none of them would forget. For Rebecca, it was a lesson money had never taught her. All her life she had believed that wealth could fix problems, that success was the answer to grief and loss. But sitting by her son's bed, holding his small hand, she realized how wrong she had been. Money could buy lights, toys, and staff, but it could not erase Alex's fear or fill his loneliness. Only love could do that. The nights she spent in his room were worth more than any contract she had ever signed. Slowly, she began to see her son in a new way. not as a fragile child to be managed, but as a strong soul who had survived more pain than most adults ever would. Each evening, as Alex drifted to sleep with only a small lamp glowing beside him, Rebecca felt both pride and regret. Pride that he was healing, regret that she had waited so long to give him what he truly needed. Over time, Alex's fear no longer defined his life. The terror that once ruled every bedtime slowly became just a part of his story, not the whole of it. He still asked for a small lamp to stay on beside his bed, but it was no longer because he felt trapped or forgotten. Instead, the gentle glow reminded him that he wasn't alone anymore. Each night when he closed his eyes, he knew that Albert and Rebecca would still be there in the morning. That security allowed him to sleep more peacefully, without the racing heart and trembling hands that used to haunt him. The difference was clear to everyone in the mansion. The little boy who once screamed at the sight of shadows now smiled as he climbed into bed, hugging his stuffed rabbit while listening to the voices of the people he trusted most. The darkness had not disappeared, but it no longer had the power to control his life. Albert had become Alex's emotional anchor. He was not his biological grandfather, and Alex understood that. But in his heart, Albert filled the role he had missed all his life. Albert treated him with the mansion no longer felt like a cage. It truly felt like home. And every night as he drifted to sleep, Alex finally felt what he had longed for most. He belonged. He still turned to see the soft light glowing by his bedside, but it was no longer his shield. It was his reminder that he was safe, that he was loved, and that he would never again be left alone in the dark. Albert often sat with him until his breathing softened, sometimes humming softly, while Rebecca stayed close, holding his hand, or sitting quietly nearby. Alex would close his eyes, knowing that if he woke, he wouldn't find an empty room, but the people who cared for him most. The fears that had once ruled his nights no longer had the same power. In their place was love, steady and real. For the first time in his young life, Alex didn't just feel like a child surrounded by wealth. He felt like a son, part of a family he could finally call his own. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.